Hello, everyone. This is Joseph Anderson with the Joseph Writer Anderson podcast. And today we are going to be diving into my meta predictions for the JJK Volume 2 format of Union Arena. So this is going to be a relatively short format because in just a couple of weeks after the full set releases, we are going to start getting into the Full Metal Alchemist format. So that's going to be really exciting. I guess it's probably more than just a couple weeks because that's when the full set's going to release. But pretty soon, the early release events for Full Metal Alchemist are going to start. And along with them, plenty of excitement for that massive set. But we're not talking about Full Metal Alchemist. We're talking about the decks that are going to be strong and powerful and mighty in the JJK Volume 2 format of the game. Union Arena just keeps rolling along at a frenetic pace with all of these fantastic IPs, deck strategies, and characters coming into the arena to do battle. I can't believe how many decks are viable to play right now. It doesn't ever stop. You would think that at some point there'd be like this tier 0 deck that just crushes everything, and that just has not happened yet. There's just plenty of decks to choose from, plenty of decks that do well, and it's an extremely exciting game. Still months later after the game originally came out. And the game, of course, also looks massively different than it did when it first came out. Although it's starting in some ways to look a little bit like its earlier days, thanks to the return of Blue Sukuna at the very top of the list. So if you're following along, you can follow along this tier list on my website. You can follow along. If you're listening on YouTube, you can listen. You can see it probably in the picture for the podcast. Again, sorry that there's no video for those people watching on YouTube, but this is primarily a podcast, and actually it's being sent to YouTube from my website. So the best place to check this out is on my website, www.josephwriteranderson.com. That's where all of the greatest and latest Union Arena content that I put out there can be found. So let's go over these decks. Now, it seems pretty clear. We don't know yet whether or not there's going to be a restriction. So there is a limitation in the Japan format of Union Arena, the Japanese version of the game, or the Asian version of the game, where I believe it's 2 starter deck Sukunas. You can only have 2 starter deck Sukunas in your deck. So that is in place because of how broken that card is and how broken Blue Sukuna can get when you have unlimited access to all the pieces. So we don't know as of the time of recording this whether or not there's going to be some kind of restriction. It could be that restriction. It could be something else. I think that we did get the restriction that Japan got around pairing those 2 characters, that Yuji and the Sukuna. So my guess is we will get some sort of restriction. I would be tempted to say, it's going to be the same, exact same as the one they got in Japan. But because of what happened with Bleach losing the 0-cost Rukia, part of me wonders if they have something else in mind for this deck. But assuming that, given all the cards we've seen, I don't think there's anything that's going to stop Blue JJK from still being up there towards the top. I think whatever restriction comes into play will more just affect how the deck is built, if that makes sense. That's essentially what happened with Purple Bleach. 0-cost Rukia was cut from the English version of the game, so therefore people went with a more hybrid 0 squad build as opposed to the Rukia build. So I think that ended up being the top Bleach deck, at least for the time being. So I think that's more going to affect that than anything else. Like maybe Nanami will show up as being the more played deck and more preferred deck, or maybe it'll just be Blue Sukuna without whatever the restriction ends up being. So that's a lot of stuff to say about something that I just don't really know about yet. But we'll find out soon enough. But I don't think that's going to change this tier list, is what I'm trying to say. And that is important because I do think that we're going to go back to sort of the earlier days. If you remember, there was a time when Blue Sukuna was essentially the most played deck. I think if you went to locals or if you went to a bigger tournament, you look at the tournament data for some of the larger online tournaments we've had, Sukuna is highly represented in many of them. it's just such a strong deck. That Malevolent Shrine can be so nasty when combined with the Sukuna. And of course, the new Sukuna gets even stronger in a way. The 7-cost Sukuna is very, very strong in his own right. So all of that to say, I think we're going to undoubtedly go back to something like that. Sukuna is going to be the deck at large, at least until Full Metal Alchemist comes out, and we'll see what happens then. But Sukuna is going to be the big bad guy in town. So what that means is, of course, when you have one deck in a meta that's pretty dominant at the expense of others, then decks that do well against that particular deck tend to rise up in popularity and play share. And so what I imagine is going to happen is, as Sukuna, this blue Sukuna deck gets popular, I think people are going to be looking for decks that can handle it, that go decently well into it. And one of the strongest plays that any Sukuna deck has is to leverage Malevolent Shrine. So what that means is that if you have a deck that can deal with Malevolent Shrine, then you're at a little bit of an advantage versus other decks that have more trouble dealing with it. So this isn't also, by the way, what I'm getting at here is just sort of a general trend that we're seeing in Union Arena. And I think it's ultimately a good trend. And that is a trend towards more sight cards being played. So a lot of decks, if there is some kind of a sight that can benefit the deck, a lot of people are just throwing that in there now. It used to be, I think, when things were more at a more basic level in the Union Arena meta, the sights didn't provide as much of a strategic advantage when we were just trying to rush in and take each other's life as quickly as possible. But I think as things get more complex, sights end up affording oftentimes a very strategic advantage. And I think that blue JJK isn't the only deck that has a really strong sight available to them. While many others do, Purple Bleach, especially the way it's built with around the Squad Zero engine, has an insanely powerful sight in the form of Royal Palace. This sight can let you draw a card every turn. It can let you sideline a card if you want to power up your Ichigo by having more cards in the sideline. It's just a really strong card, and it comes in active. Actually, as I have seen that card more and tested it in my Byakuya build, I'm surprised that that card wasn't just a staple in Bleach generally, because even if you aren't playing the Squad Zero deck, having at least one of those sites means that you can add a card to your sideline each and every turn, guaranteed. So it's a strong site. So what's happening then, especially if you look at my tier list, because I have number 1, Blue JJK, number 2, Purple Bleach. If anybody's getting a little bit of deja vu here, it's probably because Purple Bleach and Blue JJK were the original 2 decks back in the day, it feels like. Those were the 2 strongest decks around until Purple Code Geass showed up. And they also did really well at the first major in-person tournament. But regardless of that, they both have access to very strong sight cards. So when you have decks that rely on these very powerful sight cards, if you have a deck that can deal with sights, there's very few that can, you have something of a leg up against that deck. It doesn't mean that you're automatically going to win that matchup or that you then have a particularly favorable matchup, but it might just increase your odds compared to other decks. So that's partly why other than they're also just really good decks, that's partly why I'm favoring the purple JJK Toto deck with the new build that it has, as well as the yellow goddesses deck. So I think both of these decks have tools handy to them that allow them to deal with sights, and that is phenomenal, especially if it means shutting down your opponent's end of game Malevolent Shrine play. or if it means slowing down your opponent's card draw capabilities, right? So a strategically removed sight can have a bigger impact on your odds of winning than removing a character sometimes. So if you aren't familiar with these two decks, the card, it's a new card in the Purple Toto deck, and it's called Ultimate Mechamaru Mode Absolute. This card, as well as just being a strong card, gives you the option when played to choose up to one character with 3,500 or less BP on your opponent's front line and sideline it, or choose up to one sight on your opponent's field and sideline it. That's pretty incredible. That's actually the strongest, probably, sight removal tool in the game. However, there is a card in Yellow Goddesses that also can do this. So Yellow Goddesses does have access to a similarly powerful card, and that's called the Unlimited Landscape Manipulation card. So this card really stood out to me right away when Sword Art Online, the set, came out. However, back then the use of sights was relatively limited. So for me, I wasn't necessarily super stoked to have this card for the sight removing capabilities going into a meta where there wasn't really a ton of blue JJK running around, right? But now, with two of the top decks leveraging sights so inherently to their strategy, as well as other peripheral decks running sights that are important to their strategy, a card like Unlimited Landscape Manipulation ability seems really strong and really helpful. So in case you don't know what this card does, it lets you choose up to one character on your opponent's front line and up to one character with one or less energy generation on their energy line and switch them to resting. And if you chose to, you can swap them. The other effect, though, is the sight effect. So again, whenever you have a card that lets you choose between multiple effects, that's pretty strong because you now have a card that can adjust to the situation that you're in. So the other one is just choose up to one sight with one or less energy generation on your opponent's field and sideline it. So both of those effects are handy. A lot of times you use the switch to resting to help close out a game, but the one that helps make Yellow Goddesses even more relevant than it already was is the one that helps you to remove sights. So people may not catch on to this. So if you're listening to this, you're welcome. These can help you in your store tournaments. These two cards, if you're willing to pilot these two decks, can help you deal with those two decks that are the most prominent right now, or at least are going to be once Blue JJK is fully released in just a few short days. I don't see the former heavyweight champion Purple Code Geass. I don't see that deck going anywhere. It's still doing well competitively, although we are seeing it falling out in popularity. I think part of this is people are a little tired of it because it's just been such a staple for so long to the Union Arena meta. I think part of it too is that Purple Bleach in a lot of ways is faster and more powerful than Purple Code Geass. So a lot of people who want to play a really strong purple removal deck are just going to go with some version of Purple Bleach. So that's also lending to a bit of a dip in popularity for Purple Code Geass. But I don't think Purple Code Geass goes particularly badly into Blue JJK. I think that Blue JJK with Volume 2 edges it out now. It was always a tight competition. I think Purple Code Geass had the upper hand, but I think now Blue JJK edges it out. So Purple Code Geass slips a little bit in the rankings. And then at the end of the list for the top tier decks, we have Yellow Saitama. And I think that Yellow Saitama is going to remain pretty popular, especially with Blue JJK coming back out. The meta is shifting back again to that removal heavy format that we've known, while Blue JJK is becoming more a heavily control focused deck. Your anti-removal capabilities via Yellow Saitama are still going to do really well into that deck. So I think that you're already seeing Yellow Saitama showing up again at tournaments, and I think as a counter to some of these really removal heavy decks, people are going to continue to want to play Yellow Saitama with his anti-removal capabilities. And there's other ways to build this deck besides just the traditional Yellow Saitama build. You can also mix it. People are commonly mixing it with Hellish Blizzard, but I saw a really cool build that leveraged the Psychic Sisters and their event focus strategy alongside a couple copies or 3 copies of the Yellow Saitama. So I think there's a lot of creative ways to build this deck, but the one focused on Yellow Saitama is still the strongest, and that combined with the Hellish Blizzard fares very well in the meta that we're about to be in. Now moving on to the final deck in the top tier, and that is Blue SAO Aincrad. This deck just continues to do well in competition. It's massively popular right now in the Sword Art Online rare battles, and it's everywhere there, and it's doing well in normal competitions as well. And I don't see this deck necessarily going anywhere. I think the multi-attack is still very appealing into a now more control-focused Sukuna deck. I think the multi-attacks could do well in that scenario. Sukuna is playing towards the later game and not necessarily shutting down your combos before you can set them up. And then once you set them up, you can blaze past Sukuna theoretically. So I'm not trying to say that it has an advantage against Sukuna. I just don't think it's particularly disadvantaged. And it remains having all of the other advantages that have helped establish it as a top tier deck today. So that is the top tier. These are the most competitive decks. So if you are the most competitive player and you just want to have the highest win rates possible, you're probably playing one of those decks with the asterisk of the Toto and Goddesses, because those you are largely playing to not only because they have high win rates, but to counter the top tier decks. But you have to know that they counter them. Moving on to the tier 1.5 decks. These are the decks that are almost as strong as a top tier and can definitely compete in the same arena as the top tier, but they're just not going to be quite as consistent in their win rates as the top tier. But that doesn't mean they can't still win, and doesn't mean they can't still do very, very well. First, we have the Bleach Purple Ichigo Rukia build. I think this build is still undervalued. I've seen it do well at tournaments. I've had a great experience playing this deck. I think we'll see this one show up a bit more as time moves forward. But right now it's at the top of the tier 1.5 simply because it's just not being played as much as the other Bleach decks. As the other Bleach deck, I should say. But this deck still has a ton going for it. It has insane capabilities to draw and to fuel the sideline, and it just packs a powerful punch. I think it could do pretty good against Blue Sukuna as well. So I think that maybe people will play it a little more to deal with that. I also think that Green Saitama, the Green One Punch Man deck, could do really well in this current format. Again, this deck does really well against decks that love to remove because there is not a lot of great removable options for your opponent. You don't really worry so much about what your opponent's doing as much as you worry about hitting your own end game win condition with this deck. So just because your opponent has a bunch of powerful characters, that's not going to scare you too much because you're just trying to do what you do best, and that's getting your 2 action point Saitama onto the field and then just winning in a single punch. But I see this deck doing fairly well in the current format. People aren't really going to be looking for it. They're not really worried about Green Saitama anymore. They're going to be worried about getting all their favorite cards removed by Sukuna and Purple Bleach. So this deck could definitely come in and do fairly well. And then we have the Nanami build. This deck looks a lot like it used to, even with the Volume 2. It just gets a couple of cards, mostly centered around Nanami, a couple of raid targets, as well as a new raid that helps his strategy. I think this deck was always vying for the top spot in the JJK world alongside the Pure Sukuna, but I do think Pure Sukuna is definitely going to continue to edge it out. Unless if somehow whatever restriction gets released ends up making Nanami more viable. But I think that the Pure Sukuna is looking a lot more scary than even the Nanami build is. On the flip side, the Nanami does now have tools that make it much easier to reach that 15 cards or less in your deck. So if you're really, really keen on Nanami, that could be a good thing for you. And it's definitely still up there. It's still a very solid deck. That's why it's in the 1.5 range. It's just a little off that top tier. Speaking of decks, right off that top tier is Green Lancelot. I think with the likes of, if things go this way and people are currently playing a lot of Yellow Goddesses. And if people continue doing that, especially thanks to its advantage against sites, and people are playing a lot of Toto, I think traditional energy heavy green decks like Green Lancelot, Code Geass Green Lancelot are going to have trouble, because decks like Toto, you are a little safe against Yellow Goddesses, although I've not personally ever lost, I don't think, a match with Yellow Goddesses against Lancelot, because it is a favorable matchup for Yellow Goddesses. But Yellow Goddesses can't bring up your 2 energy generating characters. They can do other things that hurt your board and hurt your ability to build up that energy line. But Toto, on the other hand, has no problem bringing up whoever he pleases and completely just destroying your plans to bring out an air cavalry. So if Toto ends up being as popular to play as I think he's going to be, and I think he's going to be very popular, then Green Lancelot's going to take a hit for sure in competitive ability. Moving on to the Green Kenpachi Toshiro deck. This deck's already doing really well, and it's definitely a strong contender, even amongst the top tier decks. I think it's edged out a little bit by just some of these other decks that have stronger counters to the 2 top decks. There's nothing in this deck that's particularly countering the 2 top decks. So it's reliant largely on just how you play and how well you draw, as usual. But there's nothing in here that's like a particularly special move you can use to stop the top tier decks. And it doesn't do exceptionally well per se against the decks countering the top decks either. So it's definitely consistent and strong enough to hang in there. But I think you're going to see it probably dwindle a little bit in its popularity. Another deck, speaking of dwindling in popularity, Red Asta. So I had kind of thought Red Asta would see a bit more success than it ended up seeing, but as it stands today, Red Asta is pretty strong. It's just right off that top tier, but I don't think that it has a whole lot going for it other than its removal. I think that other decks can have a little more versatility, which is why it's hovering outside of that top tier right now. And towards the lower end of the 1.5 decks is where I would see it now. I would not say it's one of the best decks anymore. It kind of had a short-lived moment where people were pretty excited about it and hoping that it might do really, really well. But as it stands right now, I would definitely say it's off that top tier. Green GGO, similar kind of story. Lots of hype for GGO, and I know this deck does get a lot better in Volume 2. But right now, there's not any particularly compelling reason from a competitive standpoint. Obviously, if you love playing GGO, go ahead and play it. But there's not a massively compelling reason to play this deck. Doesn't have like some huge advantage against the other decks. In fact, there are definitely some strong disadvantages against some of these other decks in the top of the totem pole here. But that being said, it still has some very solid combos that, if you get them off, can be totally deadly. So it's definitely a very competitively viable deck, just not the top pick. And then finally, we have Yellow Bleach. So some people will be very happy that Yellow Bleach is on here, because Yellow Bleach, for whatever reason, seems to have a really strong following in the Union Arena world. And Yellow Bleach, I have been very surprised by how well it's been doing so far. It's definitely not that top tier, but I would say it's hovering right in between the 1.5 and the tier 2. And I put it on the 1.5 because to me it's Definitely a 1.5 deck, but it's towards the bottom of them, but it's still having some pretty decent success. People are loving that whole Giselle to the front line, bringing back a zombie, swapping Giselle out with the Uryu from the back line or whatever. So people really like this deck, and it's doing really well. So I think that there's no reason why in the JJK Volume 2 meta why that should fall off entirely. So I've been talking for a bit here. Those are the decks that are the most competitively viable in the upcoming format. The other decks below the top 2 tiers can still do very well competitively. So my point in putting this together isn't to dissuade you from playing those decks. It's more just to share what the main range of the most competitive decks are going to be, and having some understanding that if you were looking to play the decks in the tier 2 range, there's going to be some trade-offs from a matchup spread and win rate perspective. So there's these decks in the tier 2 range are definitely competitively viable to an extent, but they're just not going to be as advantageous as a tier 1 and tier 1.5, whereas the tier 2.5 decks, it's a little different here because these decks are sort of like tier 2 decks, but they need just a little extra help. Like they need decent matchups. They need a little more luck, and that's why I've put them in the tier 2.5. However, if you do hit those matchups or that luck factor, then they can really excel. So that's why I have them in their own range. Whereas the tier 3 decks are the decks that are really not competitively viable hardly at all. You're playing them more because you want to do something different or you want to do something fun, but they're not really going to be the best competitive choice for you if you're looking to bag one of the next month's winter cards or to take to your rare battle. So I hope that this has been helpful. It's the first time that I've put together one of these. I've obviously done plenty of tier lists, but this is the first time I put together like a full visual tier list for a card game. So I hope that that's helpful. Let me know if you found it helpful. And I also hope I didn't miss anybody. I think that this tier maker that I'm using is using a lot of the Japanese decks. So some of these do look a little funny. Like I think the pizza deck has the volume 2 in it, as well as a few other ones have some of the volume 2 cards. But for the most part, I was able to find decks that are the pictures that are currently in the English meta. They're not different enough that I think it'll confuse anyone too much. But I hope that is helpful, and I hope I didn't miss anyone. That's important to include because this is supposed to be sort of a broad overview look at the whole picture of the Union Arena meta and what you're likely to run into. So with that being said, I will see you next time, and thanks as always for listening.